Hey everyone, my name is Allie and welcome to my channel, and today we're going to be talking about something that I have been wanting to talk about for so long because honestly it has to do with something that I do every single day, and that is listening to audiobooks. I love audiobooks so much. First things first, before I even get into any of the meat of the video, I just want to say that I will not tolerate any comments that are like audiobooks aren't reading or anything along those lines, because this is a space where audiobooks are reading. There's just no debate about it, no conversation, no argument. So if you are already getting your little fingers ready to be like, audiobooks aren't reading, that's cheating, blah, blah, blah. I don't care. I don't care. I don't care. Storytelling has been an oral tradition since the dawn of time. I don't care if you think that audiobooks aren't reading. It is. It's a way to tell a story, and at the end of the day, saying that audiobooks aren't reading is just extremely ableist, and we're not going to tolerate that here. Since we got that out of the way, now we can talk about how I read my audiobooks, why I love audiobooks, and which ones are my favorite and which ones I want to recommend to you. So on my phone I have a folder of all of my book apps, any of the apps that are bookish like Goodreads or Storygraph, or apps that I use to read audiobooks or read ebooks. So the apps that I use to read audiobooks, which this is a question I get all the time. My main audiobook apps are Hoopla and Libby. Those are the two apps that I use all the time, and they are free through my library. So if you want to use those apps, you do have to have a library card, and I'm not really sure if your library has to be partnered with any of these apps, or if you can just sign up for these apps regardless of whether your library supports it or not. I'm not really sure, but that is definitely something that if you do have a library card that I would personally look into. If you don't have a library card, I will be leaving some links down below to some resources that might help you get a library card, whether you're in the US or outside of the US. There are definitely resources out there, so I will leave those as links down below. I also use Audible, obviously. I feel like everybody does, regardless of how you feel about Audible. Whenever my parents or my siblings have a free trial for Audible, they'll just give it to me, so or let me use it. So that's mainly how I get my Audible audiobooks. I don't use it very often. It's probably the app that I use the least often, but I just wanted to mention that one as well because obviously it's pretty accessible to most people. Same with Libro FM. I use that one a lot more, but it's kind of another one of those audiobook apps where you have to pay for a book, and I like to get my books through my library, especially audiobooks, and I like to get my audiobooks through my library, so I don't tend to use the apps that you have to pay for a book all that often. But I really love Libro FM, mainly because if you do buy an audiobook from them, it goes to support independent bookstores, smaller bookstores. So using Libro FM might be the way to go instead of Audible. I'm not really sure if there are other audiobook apps out there. If there are, I haven't tried them out. But mainly I always recommend trying out Hoopla or Libby. I feel like a lot of more people know about Libby and not as many people know about Hoopla, but I love Hoopla because unlike Libby, you don't have to wait in line for a book. You can just check out a book whenever you want. There's no waiting list, there's no wait time to borrow, and I feel like they have a really wide selection. I'm actually not sure if the selection is dictated on your area the way that Libby is, but I do like Hoopla. I feel like they have a really great selection, and they also have music, they have TV shows and movies, so you kind of have a lot to choose from in comparison to Libby. The only thing about Hoopla is that you do get a limited amount of audiobook checkouts, or just checkouts in general. So for my library, I get 10 borrows a month. That's usually more than enough, even with how many books I read per month, but that's mainly because I get to supplement it with Libby or Libro FM or Audible or whatever. So and I know that other libraries will give you only 5 borrows per month, or maybe they'll give you more borrows per month. It just depends on your library. But yeah, I just wanted to make sure that you all knew about both Hoopla and Libby, because I think that they're really great resources that sometimes get underutilized. So definitely check those out. Now I want to get into some of the audiobooks that I absolutely have loved in the past couple of years. I didn't want to go too far into the past, mainly because it's been such a long time since I read any of those audiobooks. I wanted them to be a little bit more fresh in my mind. But this morning I kind of went through the audiobooks that I've checked out from both Hoopla, Libby, the ones that I have from Libro FM, Audible, etc. And I just wanted to compile like I think I have 13 books on here that I absolutely love as audiobooks. I tried to stay away from some of the more like obvious ones. Of course, everyone mentions the audiobook for Sadie by Courtney Summers. That one, just everybody loves it, and I totally understand why. It's kind of told through almost a podcast sort of format, and while it wasn't my favorite book, the audiobook was really good. And then a lot of people also recommend Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid, which also I completely understand because it's told in sort of like an interview format, which is also really fun. And I have listened to both of those audiobooks, absolutely love them. Also The Diviners, I think it's mentioned a lot, which is another good audiobook. But I kind of wanted to talk about some more audiobooks that people don't typically mention. So the first one is one that I've read recently, and that is The Midnight Girls by Alicia Jasinska, and it's narrated by Emily Ellett, or LA, I'm not really sure. I really wanted to be able to mention the narrators for all of these audiobooks because I don't feel like narrators get nearly enough love or credit. And I mean, I loved all of these audiobooks because of the narrator. I really love this book. It's a really great YA fantasy. It's queer, it has a lot of diversity, it's really fun, and I highly recommend the audiobook. I just absolutely loved the way that it was narrated, and I feel like especially with some YA books, it can kind of go one of two ways, where either the narrator sounds perfect for the character, young enough for the character, or sometimes the narrator sounds too old. But I felt like this audiobook had a really great narrator who didn't sound too old to be like any of the characters that she was trying to portray, so I really appreciated that. The next audiobook I want to recommend is You Exist Too Much by Zaina Arafat, narrated by Zara Jane Nakvi, and I absolutely love this book so much. One of my favorite genres to read as audiobooks is definitely literary fiction. I feel like they just really resonate with me as audiobooks, and they tend to have some of my favorite narrators. I don't know why. I don't know why literary fiction gets some of the best narrators, but I absolutely love this one, and I feel like she really brought the story to life, so I highly recommend this one. Like I said, it's a literary fiction. It follows a Palestinian American woman in like, I think her mid to late 20s, somewhere around there. It's just like very much like Sally Rooney-esque. So definitely check it out. I love that book. The next audiobook I want to recommend is Honey Girl by Morgan Rogers, narrated by York Whitaker, and I loved this book as an audiobook. I think this one worked so well, mainly because the writing is so flowery, so descriptive, just a lot of metaphor, and it really worked perfectly in the audio format. And this is also a narrator that really stuck out to me when I read this book and really made the listening experience a lot more fun. Another YA fantasy audiobook that I absolutely loved was Dark of the West by Joanna Hathaway, narrated by Barry Krynick and Dan Bittner. I really love when you get to have like multiple narrators for an audiobook, especially when there are dual perspectives or multiple perspectives. I think that it really brings an audiobook to life, and these two narrators did a fantastic job. I feel like when there's more than one narrator, it really just brings the story to life. Like, you really feel like you're inside of the story, or even like you're watching it as a movie. It's just a lot of fun. So I really love this audiobook, and also this is a series. I read the second book as an audiobook as well, and it was absolutely fantastic. Highly recommend. The next audiobook I want to recommend is Where Dreams Descend by Janella Angelis, narrated by Imani Jade Powers. Loved this audiobook. This was one of my favorites, mainly because despite the fact that I believe this book is dual perspectives, this only had one narrator, but this one narrator really carried the audiobook. They did an absolutely fantastic job at doing both perspectives. And sometimes when you have like a female perspective and then a male perspective, it can get a little weird with the audiobook narrator. I've had so many audiobooks that I've read where either the female character sounds weird or the male character sounds weird, and it just doesn't work. But this one I feel like did a fantastic job at doing both of the characters and all of the voices, and just kudos to that narrator. It's a hard thing to do, to try to do like every single character of any gender. I just highly respect anyone who can do it. The next audiobook I want to recommend is also kind of part of a series that I've read all as audiobooks, and that is The Heiress Gets a Duke by Harper St. George, narrated by Justine Eyre. I love these books as audiobooks, and you know what, most historical romance I do prefer as an audiobook. I don't know why, it just really gets me in the mood. It really like puts me into this historical setting, and I absolutely love it. And I think that The Heiress Gets a Duke has one of my favorite narrators for historical romance, and I don't know, this book just has one of my favorite narrators for historical fiction. She just does a fantastic job. The next book I want to recommend is A Study in Charlotte by Brittany Cavallaro, and that's narrated by Graham Halstead and Julia Whelan. Right? Whelan? I have read, I think, a few books narrated by Julia Whelan. I'm not really sure how to pronounce her name, but I absolutely love the audiobooks for this series. They are fantastic. I did first read the series physically, and then I reread the series as audiobooks, and just chef's kiss fantastic. Amazing audiobooks. Some of my favorites of all time, but then again, I mean, I love the books, so I think that the audiobooks just added to the amazing experience that I have with this series. I think that these books are perfect for fall, especially these audiobooks. They'll just get you right in the mood, and like, you know, when the leaves are falling, changing colors, everything is getting a little chillier. I think A Study in Charlotte is like the perfect series to pick up. The next book that I want to recommend is Nevada by Imogen Binnie, and that is also narrated by the author herself. And I absolutely love this book, and I'm unsurprised by how amazing the book is because it's narrated by the author. I feel like sometimes it can be a bit of a mixed bag when it's narrated by the author, but I almost, more times than not, I do prefer when the author narrates their own book. It just really works for me. I don't know why. I think maybe it's because like the book is so special to them, so hearing them read it just makes the whole experience even better. And that might be why I love a good memoir. That actually makes a lot of sense now. But I absolutely love Nevada, and it talks a lot about the trans experience, and specifically the author's trans experience sort of fictionalized, and I loved it. It was fantastic. The narration was wonderful and totally spot on. So the next audiobook I want to talk about is Who is Maud Dixon by Alexandra Andrews, narrated by Teresa Plummer. And I really enjoyed this audiobook, and it kind of was a weird experience, mainly because I started reading it physically because I had the book physically, and then I lost it. Subsequently lost the book. I don't know how I ended up doing that. It fell out of my tote bag, and it is now lost forever. So once that happened, I had to quickly switch over to the audiobook, and thankfully the audiobook was absolutely fantastic. Teresa Plummer did an amazing job narrating this book, and it just ended up being a really smooth transition for me, which, you know, sometimes this happens where maybe I'm just like in a slump, or I lose a book, or just something happens with the physical book where I cannot read it. And sometimes the transition from physical book to audiobook is a little rocky or just doesn't really work for me, but thankfully this one was absolutely fantastic. It really put me into the book, and I just remember being in those last few chapters of the book being like on the edge of my seat, just sucked into the audiobook. I could barely play any of like the games that I typically play while I read audiobooks because I am a multitasker at heart, or at least I like to think that I am. But with audiobooks, I absolutely can multitask. I like to, you know, do the dishes or do my laundry or whatever while I read an audiobook. But also my favorite thing to do while I read an audiobook is play little games on my phone. So I have like Tetris, I have Candy Crush, I have both versions of Candy Crush, the soda Candy Crush and the regular one, and then I also will play like 8-ball pool on my phone. So I have a couple different games that I like to kind of go through while I read a book, but you know an audiobook is really good when you don't even need to play any of those games just to kind of like get your mind in that mode. You just are sucked in, and that's what happened with this book, and I absolutely loved it. So all credit goes to that narrator for really bringing the story to life. The next audiobook I want to recommend is Normal People by Sally Rooney, and that is narrated by Aoife McMahon, right?
We are looking at how to pronounce the traditional Irish name spelled A-O-I-F-E. You can pretty much ignore the first 2 letters when you pronounce it and simply say Aoife.
Aoife, I was right. Oh my god, I'm so proud of myself. We had to listen to a little pronunciation guide for that name for a second just so I could know that I knew how to pronounce it. It's narrated by Aoife McMahon, and I love this narrator so much. I have listened to every single Sally Rooney book as an audiobook, mainly because A, I don't really own any of her books physically except for Beautiful World, Where Are You? And secondly, even I am a little intimidated by the fact that there are no quotation marks. So if you are ever in like a pinch and you want to read one of her books but are also intimidated by the fact that there are no quotation marks, you might want to check out the audiobooks. Aoife McMahon does a fantastic job at narrating these books, just really does the voices so well, really brings these books to life, brings the characters to life, and I feel like I can get lost in these audiobooks. They're some of my favorites. I mentioned Normal People, obviously. I think that might have been my favorite one, but she also narrates the one for Beautiful World, Where Are You? And also Conversations with Friends. So all of them I highly recommend. Maybe Conversations with Friends less so, but I think that you should still read it anyway, even if it's not like my favorite book in the whole wide world. But definitely Normal People and Beautiful World, Where Are You? 2 of her best novels. The next one I want to recommend actually just celebrated its 1st birthday, and that is Within These Wicked Walls by Lauren Blackwood, narrated by Nika Okoye. And I loved this book so much. One of my favorite gothic romance horror books, and I just love this narrator so much. I feel like, you know, with every audiobook I've said, it's just been like this narrator brings it to life, but really this narrator truly embodied these characters and did such a good job with this gothic romance horror. I think that sometimes the gothic setting can be a little bit difficult for some narrators. Not necessarily that there's like a certain type of voice that's good for these books, it's just like you kind of have to be both romantic and spooky and kind of old-timey, and I think that this narrator did a really good job at combining all of these aspects into a really, really great narration. And I just absolutely loved it. One of my favorite gothic romance horror books. I know it's like kind of a mouthful, but it really just embodies all of those genres and does it so well. And this audiobook I highly, highly recommend. If you're gonna read this book, read it as an audiobook. It's so, so well done. The second to last audiobook I want to recommend is actually kind of a 3-for-1 because I specifically wanted to mention Act Your Age, Eve Brown by Talia Hibbert, narrated by Iona Butler, but I also wanted to recommend the other 2 audiobooks for this series, which are also Take a Hint, Dani Brown, and Get a Life, Chloe Brown. So I wanted to recommend all of those books as audiobooks because once again, that's how I read the entire series, but I wanted to mention Act Your Age, Eve Brown mainly because I read this audiobook in one sitting. I literally started it at like 7 o'clock at night and I finished it sometime early in the morning, and I did not sleep that night. I nearly pulled an all-nighter. It was just such a fantastic audiobook. The narrator does such a wonderful, wonderful job at really sucking you into this story. Like, I could not put this audiobook down. It was fantastic. It was so good, and I just highly recommend this entire series as an audiobook. I wouldn't necessarily recommend all of Talia Hibbert's books as audiobooks because I did read The Princess Trap as an audiobook and I personally did not like it. I know a lot of other people have an issue with the audiobook because the narrator, I believe there might be 2 narrators, but the male narrator for that book, no thank you. No thanks. Actually, you know what? I think it might just be a male narrator. I really can't remember at this point, but I remember not really liking it and kind of making a note of it in my updates for Goodreads, being like, this audiobook feels really weird and I don't really like it. I think it was just some of the pronunciation and like, it was a little much. But I highly, highly recommend the Brown Sisters trilogy for audiobooks. Just fantastic. You will finish each of these audiobooks in one sitting, guaranteed. And the last audiobook I wanted to recommend was The Inheritance of Orquídea Divina by Zoraida Cordova, narrated by Frankie Corzo. And I loved this audiobook. It was fantastic. It was actually, I think, one of the first times I'd ever read a Zoraida Cordova book as an audiobook, so it's kind of like a new territory for me. I feel like when you're so used to reading an author's books physically, it can kind of be a weird jump into reading them as audiobooks and vice versa. Like if you're used to reading a certain author's books through audio, it can be a little weird to jump into physical, but with this book I just absolutely fell in love with the audiobook. It was so beautifully done. It was just absolutely gorgeous and lush and really brought the setting to life, and a really good job at taking these characters and getting them to leap off the page. And I also really enjoyed getting to hear all of these names and places pronounced through audio, and I think that that's definitely a bonus when you're listening to audiobooks instead of reading it physically, especially if the entire book isn't fully in English. I think that it's really fun to kind of get to hear the non-English words spoken through audio, so I really appreciated that about this book. And yeah, just overall a really great narration, and I would love to see more books from this specific narrator. Actually, that goes for really any of these narrators. I feel like I didn't mention any of the ones that are like typically mentioned. I feel like one of the most famous ones that I can think of off the top of my head is January Lavoie, and I didn't mention her at all in this one, which is so weird because I feel like I've read so many books narrated by January Lavoie and I typically love her narrations. I kind of wanted to stick to some audiobooks that are not as well known or not as well recommended, but I really enjoyed all of these books and I highly recommend them to you. So if you're hearing about them for the first time, definitely go check them out. Also down below in the comments, let me know some of the audiobooks that you really love. I love hearing people talk about audiobooks, and I definitely want to find some new ones to jump into, so let me know. And if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Also go ahead and follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Goodreads, Storygraph, TikTok. All the links are going to be down below, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye!
Ooh, I thought it'd be me and you. Oh.